The ledger never lied. George Brennan sat hunched over his desk, lamplight casting long shadows across columns of red ink that seemed to bleed into the wood grain itself. Every muscle in his body ached from another 16-hour day in the fields. His hands, calloused and cracked from honest labor, trembled slightly as he totaled the year's accounts for the third time, hoping somehow the mathematics would change. They didn't. Outside the cabin window, wheat fields glowed amber in the dying sunset. The harvest had been magnificent, the best yield he'd seen in a decade of working this land. Row after row of grain standing thick and proud, exactly as his father had taught him. Every fence straight, every irrigation channel maintained, every seed planted with the precision of a man who knew soil like scripture, and yet the numbers told their brutal truth. Another year of profit lost. George leaned back in his chair, the wood creaking under his weight. His gaze drifted to the photograph on the mantel, his father, stern and capable, standing before this very homestead when it was new. Thomas Brennan had built this place from raw prairie, turned wilderness into prosperity with nothing but determination and sweat. "I'm doing everything right," George whispered to the empty room. The silence answered him with doubt. He'd followed every lesson his father taught. Rise before dawn, work until dark. Plant what grows best in this soil, maintain equipment, respect the land. The formula had worked for 30 years under his father's hands. Why did it fail under his? George closed the ledger with more force than necessary. The sound echoed in the sparse cabin, no wife's voice to soften it, no children's laughter to fill the spaces. Just a man in his failing dream, alone with arithmetic that refused to balance. Through the window, the last light faded from the fields. Beautiful, abundant, worthless. He'd planted everything his father taught him to plant, grown it exactly as instructed, harvested at the proper time. Every step executed with expertise earned through years of practice. The market didn't care about expertise. George stood, bones protesting. Tomorrow he'd haul another wagon load to the grain buyers in town. They'd offer whatever they offered. He'd accept whatever they paid. The cycle would continue until the bank finally lost patience or he lost the will to keep fighting. Mathematics. He extinguished the lamp, letting darkness claim the cabin. Outside, stars emerged over the prairie, indifferent and eternal. Somewhere in that vastness, there had to be an answer. Some missing piece his father never taught because his father never needed it. But George Brennan didn't know what he didn't know. And ignorance, he was learning, cost more than any crop failure ever could. The general store smelled of leather, coffee, and Saturday morning commerce. George maneuvered his wagon alongside the loading dock, watching Tom Fletcher's boys stack crates with the casual efficiency of youth. The town of Clearwater Springs bustled with its weekly rhythm ranchers comparing notes, wives gathering supplies, children darting between displays like minnows in a stream. "Brennan?" Tom Fletcher nodded from behind the counter, his expression carrying that careful neutrality people wore around failure. "Hear you had a good harvest this year." "Best yield yet." George kept his voice steady. "That's something. Anyway." The words hung there, polite and hollow. Everyone in Clearwater Springs knew good yields and good profits weren't the same thing. George had become the cautionary tale mothers whispered to sons: work hard, but work smart, or end up like poor Brennan. The door chimed. Conversations paused. She entered like a foreign word in a familiar sentence posture, too straight for frontier practicality. Dressed too fine despite obvious adjustments for Western life. The new widow everyone had been discussing since she'd settled at the old Miller property 2 weeks ago. Rebecca Harper moved through the store with quiet purpose, her eyes scanning the market reports posted near the counter. George noticed her noticing things: prices, dates, supply notes that most folks ignored. She read them the way he read weather signs, with focused attention that suggested understanding. Fletcher cleared his throat. "Mrs. Harper, welcome. What can I get you today?" "Good morning, Mr. Fletcher." Her voice carried city education softened by genuine warmth. "Just reviewing current grain prices. Fascinating patterns this season. George stiffened. He was arranging payment for his harvest delivery, another abundant load that would barely cover costs. She couldn't possibly understand the calculations involved. The variables that determined whether a man survived or went under. Rebecca turned, seeming to notice him for the first time. Her gaze moved from his work-worn clothes to the wagon outside, loaded with premium wheat, then back to the price sheet on the wall. "Forgive me," she said, stepping closer. "Are you selling that Western white wheat?" "I am. At current market rate, that's what they're offering." Something shifted in her expression, not judgment exactly, but recognition. Like watching someone walk toward a cliff edge they couldn't see. "You're planting wrong for this market," she said gently. The store went quiet. George felt heat crawl up his neck. Fletcher found something fascinating about his account books. Even the children seemed to sense adult tension brewing. "I know farming, ma'am." George's voice came out harder than intended. "I meant no disrespect. Mr. Brennan." She met his eyes without flinching. "I simply recognize patterns. The market's been shifting toward winter varieties for 18 months. Western white is flooding the exchanges. Your timing and variety selection are creating unnecessary losses. Don't need city patterns." He straightened to full height. "This is frontier soil. Been farming it 10 years. "Of course." Rebecca nodded. No argument in her posture. "I'm sure you know your land better than anyone." But her calm certainty unsettled him more than argument would have. She gathered her purchases, paid Fletcher, and moved toward the door with the same quiet grace she'd entered with. At the threshold, she paused. The Miller property has excellent records from the previous owner. Market analyses. Crop rotation schedules adjusted for commercial demand, rather than just soil capacity. You're welcome to review them any time. Mr. Brennan, neighborly offer. Nothing more. Then she was gone, leaving silence and speculation in her wake. Fletcher whistled low. City widows got opinions. City widows got no idea what she's talking about. George signed the delivery receipt with unnecessary force. But riding home that afternoon, wagon lighter and purse barely heavier, he couldn't shake the memory of her eyes scanning those market reports, reading them like language, like meaning, like something that mattered, like something he'd never learned to read at all. The cemetery sat on the eastern rise, where morning sun hit first and evening light lingered longest. George's father had chosen his own burial spot the way he'd chosen everything with practical consideration, for aesthetics and meaning both. George knelt before the weathered headstone, pulling weeds that always grew fastest where they were least welcome. Another harvest coming in. "Pa," he spoke quietly, though no one was around to hear. "Best yield I've managed yet. Fields are producing exactly like you taught me." Wind moved through the prairie grass, carrying the scent of autumn's approach. Overhead, geese arrowed south in ragged formations, following instincts older than human settlement. Everything in its season. Everything according to nature's calendar. That widow from St. Louis tried giving me advice today. George yanked a stubborn thistle. "Thinks she knows better than 10 years of experience, than 30 years of your teaching." Thomas Brennan Stone offered no counsel, just dates and a simple epitaph. He built this land honest. Honest. George had built his life on that word. Honest work, honest dealings. Honest belief that good soil and hard labor would always win against bad luck and hard times. His father had proved it possible. Why couldn't he? The memory surfaced unbidden his father's final months, when sickness had taken strength but left mind sharp. They'd reviewed the farm's operations together. Walking fields Thomas could no longer work himself. "You know the land, son," his father had said. "That's what matters. Grow it right. The rest takes care of itself." But the rest wasn't taking care of itself. George stood, brushing dirt from his knees. In town, Rebecca Harper was probably settling into the Miller house, arranging whatever city furniture she'd brought, organizing her life with the same systematic attention she'd given those market reports. His jaw tightened. What did a widow from St. Louis know about frontier agriculture, about soil composition and weather patterns? And the 100 variables that separated good farming from disaster, she'd probably never touched earth, except through garden gloves. Never felt autumn frost warning of early winter. Never calculated yield based on rainfall and sunshine hours. Yet her words echoed. Planning wrong for this market. George walked back toward his horse, past headstones marking Clearwater Springs' brief history. The Johnsons, dead in the winter of 1871. The Patterson baby, lived 3 days. Old man Sutter, killed by a tree he was felling. The frontier took and took and took. But it gave too. If you knew how to receive, his father had known. Had turned raw prairie into productive land through knowledge passed from his father before him. Generational wisdom, tested and proven. Why should George question it now? Just because some widow suggested different varieties and better. Timing. He mounted his horse, looking back at the family plot one more time. 3 generations of Brennans rested here. 3 generations of men who'd built their legacy through farming expertise. The 4th generation was losing what they'd built. George rode home as afternoon shadows lengthened. The wheat fields spread golden around him, beautiful and damning. He'd done everything right according to the only teachers he'd ever trusted. Every seed placed with precision, every practice honored, and the ledger still bled red. First frost arrived that night, earlier than usual. George watched ice crystals form on his window. Nature's warning that winter approached whether men were ready or not. The growing season was ending. Market decisions were made. Whatever profits or losses this year brought were essentially locked in now. Next year would require different choices. George stared at the frost patterns, seeing something like letters in their random formations, messages written in a language he'd never learned to read, ignored because his father hadn't taught him they mattered. Maybe that wasn't his father's failure. Maybe it was his own. October painted the prairie in shades of gold and amber, the kind of beauty that made poets of practical men. George's harvest came in abundant and timely. Every sheaf perfectly dried, every grain premium quality. His father would have been proud of the execution. The market was not. Best I can do is $3 a bushel, the grain buyer said, not meeting George's eyes. Markets flooded with Western white. Everyone planted it this year. George's stomach dropped. $3 wouldn't cover production costs, much less turn profit. It's premium quality, worth at least $4.50. Worth and price ain't the same thing. Brennan, the buyer shrugged, genuine sympathy in his voice. Too much supply, not enough demand. Winter varieties are what mills want now. Been that way since spring. According to the exchanges, since spring. When George had been planting exactly what his father taught him to plant, he accepted the buyer's offer because refusing meant total loss. Watched them load his abundant harvest onto rail cars headed east, toward markets that didn't want what he'd grown. The mathematics were brutal and simple. He'd spent more producing this crop than he'd earned selling it. Back at the general store, Fletcher was sympathetic. Tough year for Western white growers. Anyone else get caught? Few folks. Most switched varieties back in spring when the market report started showing the shift. Fletcher paused. Mrs. Harper mentioned it to several ranchers. Those who listened did all right with winter wheat and barley rotation. George's hands tightened on the counter. She told people. Neighborly advice. She called it, same as she offered you? Fletcher's tone carried no judgment, just facts. Henderson listened. Morrison too. They're showing profit this year. First time Morrison's been black in 3 seasons. The words landed like physical blows, while George had been defending his father's methods, dismissing city interference. Other ranchers had been listening, learning, adapting, winning. He rode home past Rebecca's property, saw lamplight in her window. The Miller house looked well-maintained now, garden organized with mathematical precision, even the fence posts aligned with disturbing exactness. Everything she touched seemed to carry that same systematic order. Everything he touched seemed to bleed money. At home, George spread his father's old journals across the kitchen table. Decades of farming wisdom, carefully recorded, planting schedules, crop rotations, soil amendments. Everything a man needed to know about growing food from frontier dirt. Nothing about reading markets. Nothing about supply and demand. Nothing about timing sales or choosing varieties based on commercial patterns rather than just soil. Suitability. His father had been a brilliant farmer. The world had changed into something that required more than brilliant farming. George opened his current ledger, forcing himself to face the full scope of disaster. 5 years of increasing losses. 5 years of abundant harvests that translated to mounting debt. 5 years of doing everything exactly right according to teachings that were no longer sufficient. The cabin felt smaller suddenly, walls pressing in. This place his father built. This legacy 3 generations had maintained. It was dying under George's stewardship, not through laziness or incompetence, but through ignorance of things he'd never been taught mattered. Things Rebecca Harper understood instinctively. He remembered her expression in the general store, not mockery or superiority, just recognition. Like watching someone about to step in a hole they couldn't see. She'd tried warning him. Gently, respectfully. He'd responded with pride and dismissal. Outside, wind stripped leaves from the cottonwood his father had planted 40 years ago. Nature shed what no longer served, made room for new growth. Trees understood adaptation better than some men. George closed the journals, stacking them carefully. Wisdom didn't become worthless just because it was incomplete. His father had taught him everything needed for the frontier of 1850. But this was 1884, and the frontier had become something his father never anticipated. Something George didn't understand, but Rebecca Harper did. His pride tasted like ash. His defensiveness felt like the very stubbornness that was destroying everything his family had built. And sitting alone in lamplight, surrounded by evidence of his failures, George Brennan finally understood the difference between knowing farming and knowing business. He knew farming, she knew business, and without both, the farm would die. George's hand raised to knock 3 times before he actually struck wood. Each time, pride pulled it back. Each time, necessity pushed it forward again. Finally, knuckles met door with 3 sharp raps that sounded like surrender. Rebecca opened it, surprise flickering across her face. "Mr. Brennan." "Ma'am." He removed his hat, gripping the brim too tight, wondering if that offer still stands. About reviewing those Miller records. Understanding softened her expression. No triumph. No "I told you so," just simple compassion that somehow made the moment bearable. "Of course. Please, come in." The Miller house interior showed the same systematic organization as the exterior. Books arranged by size, kitchen implements grouped by function, even the firewood stacked with geometric precision. George felt suddenly aware of his own cabin's comfortable chaos. Rebecca gestured to the kitchen table, already spread with ledgers and market reports. "I've been analyzing regional patterns. Coffee. Please." She poured 2 cups, movements efficient and graceful. George noticed her hands, not soft city hands anymore, but not frontier roughened either. Somewhere between. Adapting. "I need help." The words came hard, scraping his throat raw. "You were right about the market. About my planting, about everything." Rebecca settled across from him, hands wrapped around her cup. "You weren't wrong about knowing your land. Mr. Brennan, your father taught you well. But land knowledge and market knowledge are different skills. Both matter. He never learned the market side. Different era. When your father started, demand exceeded supply. Growing quality crops was enough." She pulled a chart toward them. "But railroads changed everything. Suddenly Kansas wheat competes with Illinois. Wheat competes with California wheat. Supply ballooned. Success requires understanding not just what grows well, but what sells well." George studied the chart's supply curves, demand projections, price fluctuations mapped across seasons. foreign language becoming gradually readable under her patient explanation. Winter wheat here. Rebecca's finger traced a line. Market's been signaling preference for 18 months. Higher protein content, better milling characteristics. Same soil you're farming. Just different variety and adjusted timing. Why didn't I see this? Because you were looking at soil, not markets. Nothing shameful in that. You were taught to watch Earth, not exchanges. She met his eyes directly. But now you need both. They worked through the evening, lamplight creating an intimate circle as she explained crop rotation strategies that considered commercial demand alongside soil health, water management techniques that reduced costs without reducing yields, timing adjustments that caught price peaks instead of glutted markets. George's mind reeled with information, but something deeper was happening too. The way she explained complex concepts simply, the respect she showed his expertise even while expanding it, the genuine partnership in her tone, not teacher to student, but colleague to colleague. Your father built something remarkable, Rebecca said softly. This farm has excellent bones. The infrastructure, the soil quality, the water access, it's all there. You're not failing his legacy. You're just missing tools he never needed. And you have those tools. I do. No false modesty. My husband owned a lumber business in St. Louis. I managed the accounts, tracked market trends, negotiated contracts. When he died, I kept the business running 2 years before selling it at profit. She paused. I understand numbers the way you understand soil. Why help me? The question hung between them. Rebecca looked toward the window, where darkness pressed against glass. Because I can, she said finally. Should that not be reason enough, past midnight? They'd reorganized his entire operation on paper. New planting schedule, different crop varieties, adjusted water management, supplier negotiations, market timing strategies. The farm that was bleeding money became, in theory, potentially profitable. George gathered the papers, mind spinning with information and something else, gratitude mixed with attraction, mixed with hope. He'd forgotten how to feel. Why did you come west? The question escaped before he could stop it. Woman with your skills could have stayed in St. Louis, lived comfortable. Rebecca smiled, something sad in it. Comfortable isn't always what we need. Mr. Brennan, sometimes we need space, new air, chance to be something besides what grief made us. He understood that more than she knew. Walking home under autumn stars, papers tucked carefully under his arm, George felt lighter than he'd felt in years. Not because problems were solved, implementation would be hard, risky, expensive, but because he finally understood what he was fighting. And he wasn't fighting alone anymore. November brought cold mornings and colder whispers. Rebecca's presence at the Brennan homestead became regular as sunrise reviewing accounts, adjusting plans, consulting on supplier contracts, her buggy parked by his barn 4 times weekly. Sometimes she stayed for dinner, helping cook while they discussed crop rotations. The town noticed. George first felt the shift at Sunday service. Mrs. Harrington's tight smile, Mr. Cooper's knowing nod. The way conversations paused when he approached, resumed differently after he passed. Clearwater Springs was small enough that privacy was rumor's first casualty. Here you got yourself a business partner, Henderson mentioned after service, tone carefully neutral. Mrs. Harper's been helpful with market analysis. I bet she has. Henderson's expression carried implications George didn't want to examine. By Wednesday, the whispers had crystallized into confrontation. George was loading supplies at Fletcher's when Martha Harrington approached, her face set with righteous concern. The store grew quiet. Everyone suddenly fascinated by merchandise. George Brennan, she said, voice carrying, we need to speak plainly. Ma'am, that widow's got you dancing to her tune. Martha's eyes swept the watching crowd. gathering support. A woman managing a man's affairs your father would turn in his grave. Heat crawled up George's neck. Mrs. Harper is providing business consultation. Business. Martha made the word sound indecent. She's at your property more than is proper. Sharing meals. Staying past dark. People talk. George. Let them talk. It reflects poorly on her reputation, and yours. Martha softened slightly. I mean no cruelty, but propriety matters. A widow and unmarried man spending so much time alone, it creates scandal where maybe none exists. George wanted to defend Rebecca fully, publicly. Wanted to tell Martha Harrington that Rebecca's mind was saving what his pride nearly destroyed, that her understanding of markets made her more valuable than 10 conventional ranchers. But the words stuck, because part of him still felt the shame of needing a woman's help. Part of him still heard his father's voice saying men should handle their own affairs. Part of him feared the town might be right that accepting Rebecca's expertise made him somehow less capable, less masculine, less worthy of respect. I appreciate your concern, he said finally, the compromise tasting like betrayal. Rebecca heard about it secondhand. Fletcher's wife mentioned it while shopping. Not realizing Rebecca was 2 aisles over, George learned this when Rebecca appeared at his door that evening. Her expression carefully composed. Perhaps I should step back, she said without preamble. I don't wish to damage your standing in the community. Your advice is working. And causing talk. She met his eyes. I've weathered scandal before. Mr. Brennan, I can weather it again. But you live here. These people are your neighbors, your customers, your future. If my presence costs you that, it won't. But even saying it, George knew he was lying. They continued working, but differently now. Rebecca came only after dark, left before dawn. Their collaboration moved underground, hidden from eyes that judged what they couldn't understand. The improvements continued, suppliers renegotiated. New planting strategies finalized. Water systems optimized. But the hiding ate at George like rot. One evening, reviewing ledgers by lamplight, Rebecca set down her pencil. This feels wrong. What does hiding, sneaking? Like we're ashamed of work that's saving your farm. She gestured at the papers between them. There's nothing improper here. Nothing shameful. Just two people using their different skills toward common goal. I know. And then why let them make it something else? George had no good answer. Fear, maybe, or cowardice dressed up as social sensitivity. The same defensive pride that had rejected her advice now made him hide their partnership, as if admitting her value somehow diminished his. Rebecca stood, gathering her things. I'll continue helping, but I won't continue hiding. Either our work matters enough to defend publicly, or it doesn't matter at all. She left him with that choice. Lamplight suddenly feeling insufficient against gathering dark. Outside, first snow was falling light, tentative, just dusting the ground. Winter's warning shot. Time to make decisions about spring planting, about strategies, about who George Brennan would be when tested by public opinion versus private truth. He looked at the papers spread across his table. Months of Rebecca's patient teaching. Her systematic reorganization of systems that were failing. Black ink beginning to replace red in projections that hadn't shown profit in 5 years. She'd saved what he was too proud to save alone, and he'd repaid her by hiding their partnership like something shameful. The snow fell harder, covering everything in white, covering tracks, covering evidence, covering truth. George closed his eyes, knowing winter would force clarity he'd been avoiding. Spring planting required decisions. Those decisions required public acknowledgement of who deserved credit. The town would judge, but maybe their judgment mattered less than his integrity. 3 a.m. felt lonelier than midnight ever could. George sat at his kitchen table, coffee cold in his cup. Preliminary fall sales reports spread like accusations across the scarred wood. Numbers that should have been red were edging toward black. 5 years of losses slowly reversing under strategies Rebecca had patiently taught. Her systems worked. His pride had nearly destroyed everything anyway. Outside, winter stars burned cold and distant. Inside, lamplight barely pushed back the darkness of his own conscience. He'd hidden their partnership to protect his reputation. But what reputation was worth preserving if built on lies and cowardice? The sales reports told their story. In unforgiving mathematics, grain varieties Rebecca suggested profitable. Timing she recommended optimal. Supplier negotiations she guided cost-effective. Water management she designed efficient. Every decision she'd influenced showed positive results. Every decision he'd made alone, before her, had bled money. George's hands shook slightly as he totaled the preliminary numbers. First legitimate profit in 5 years. Not huge recovery took time, but real, undeniable. His farm was being saved by a woman's expertise while he sneaked around pretending otherwise. The shame of it burned hotter than any town gossip ever could. Dawn came slowly, winter light grudging and gray. With it came the mail buggy, and with the mail came an envelope bearing the Clearwater Springs Social Committee letterhead. George opened it already knowing what it contained. Annual Christmas Social. Sunday next. All community members invited. The gathering where reputations were made or broken, where standing was confirmed or questioned, where Clearwater Springs took stock of itself and its members, where George would be asked, directly or indirectly, about the widow everyone was discussing. He could minimize her contributions, suggest she'd offered minor advice he'd mostly ignored. Let the town believe masculine competence had solved masculine problems. Protect his reputation at the cost of truth and honor. Or he could stand up and speak plainly about Rebecca's role in saving his farm. The choice should have been easy. George spent the morning reviewing every change Rebecca had implemented, forcing himself to see clearly what pride had obscured. She hadn't just offered suggestions. She'd reorganized everything: crop selection, rotation schedules, market timing, supplier relationships, water management, cost analysis. The farm operating now was fundamentally different from the farm that had been failing. Her farm as much as his, maybe more. By afternoon, something had crystallized. Not dramatic revelation, but quiet recognition. The same recognition he'd seen in Rebecca's eyes that first day at the general store, understanding what path led where, seeing the cliff edge before walking over it. He shaved carefully that evening. Ritual precision calming his nerves. Put on his best shirt, the one his mother had made years ago. Polished boots that rarely saw polish. Not courting clothes, exactly. But armor for a different kind of battle. Rebecca answered his knock with surprise. "Mr. Brennan, is something wrong? Need to ask you something." George held his hat, fingers working the brim. "The Christmas social next Sunday. Will you come with me?" She studied his face, reading what he wasn't saying. "The town already talks. Let them talk. I'm done hiding what you've done for this farm." He met her eyes directly. "You saved what I was too stubborn to save alone. Time the town heard that truth, whatever they think of it. This could damage you. Living dishonorably damages me worse." George's voice steadied. "You reorganized my entire operation, taught me things my father never knew, made profitable what was dying. I'll not diminish that to please people who don't understand it." Rebecca's expression shifted surprise, giving way to something warmer. "You're certain. Only thing I'm certain of lately." He managed a small smile. "Well, that and winter wheat prices trending up for spring." She laughed, the sound warming the cold evening. "You've been studying the reports. Had a good teacher." "Sunday then," Rebecca agreed. "Together?" Walking home under stars that no longer felt quite so cold. George felt something settle in his chest. Fear remained the social would be difficult. Judgments would come. But fear mattered less than integrity. And integrity demanded acknowledging truth. Whatever the cost. His father had taught him to build honest. Time to prove he'd learned that lesson, even if applying it looked different than Thomas Brennan might have imagined. The Christmas social would force his public stand. George would defend Rebecca's contributions, claim her expertise as equal partnership, refuse to minimize her role for social comfort. And if Clearwater Springs couldn't accept that, then maybe Clearwater Springs needed to evolve as much as George had. He slept better that night than he'd slept in months. Truth, he was discovering, made surprisingly comfortable bedding. The community hall smelled of pine boughs and cinnamon. Christmas decorations disguising the usual scent of old wood and older judgments. Clearwater Springs had gathered in Sunday finest. The social less celebration than annual accounting of who stood where in the town's complicated hierarchy. George arrived with Rebecca, her hand resting lightly on his arm. Conversations paused. Eyes tracked their entrance. Martha Harrington's expression could have frozen the punch bowl. Courage. Rebecca murmured, partnership. George corrected. They moved through the gathering, accepting greetings that ranged from genuine warmth to icy politeness. Henderson nodded approvingly. Morrison grinned outright. But the Harringtons maintained careful distance, and Judge Cooper's wife made a show of turning away. The social proceeded through its familiar rhythms: food, conversation, children darting between adults. George felt the pressure building like storm clouds, knowing the real confrontation waited for after dinner. During the traditional year-end reflections when members shared successes and challenges, finally, Judge Cooper called for attention. Time for our annual sharing. Who'll start? Morrison stood, had our best year in a decade, took advice on crop rotation from Mrs. Harper, paid off handsomely. Murmurs rippled through the hall. Rebecca kept her expression neutral, but George saw color rise in her cheeks. Henderson spoke next. Same here. Her market analysis saved us from the Western white glut, showed real profit. More murmurs, these carrying different tone. Mrs. Harrington's face had gone tight. When silence fell again, George stood, his chair scraped loud in the quiet. Most of you know my farm's been struggling 5 years. His voice carried steady, though his heart hammered. Best harvests I ever grew. Worst finances I ever saw. Worked harder than any man here. Lost money every season anyway. The room watched, waiting. Rebecca Harper identified my problems in 5 minutes. George looked at her, then back to the gathering. Said I was planting wrong for the market. I told her I knew farming. Dismissed her advice out of pride and ignorance. Martha Harrington shifted, preparing to speak. George continued before she could. Another failed harvest proved her right. I swallowed my pride and asked for help. She reorganized everything: crop selection, rotation schedules, market timing, supplier negotiations, water management, cost analysis. Spent hours teaching me things my father never knew because his era didn't require them. He paused, letting that sink in. This year, for the first time in 5 years, my farm shows profit. Not huge, but real. That's Rebecca's doing. Her expertise, her knowledge, her patient teaching of a stubborn man who thought working hard meant working smart. Martha Harrington stood. This is highly irregular. George, a woman managing a man's affairs. A woman saving a man's livelihood. George's voice firmed. Using skills she earned through years of business management that I never learned. Is that irregular? Or is it practical? Is it scandalous? Or is it partnership between people with different, but equally valuable expertise? Your father, Martha, began. Built this land honest. George interrupted. And honesty means acknowledging truth even when uncomfortable. Truth is, Rebecca Harper saved my farm. My father taught me everything about growing crops. She taught me everything about selling them profitably. Both skills matter. Both teachers deserve respect. Judge Cooper studied them thoughtfully. You're saying her contributions were substantial. I'm saying without her knowledge, I'd be bankrupt by spring. George's words dropped like stones in still water. She reorganized systems that were failing, taught me to read markets I'd been ignoring, turned 5 years of red ink toward black through expertise I didn't possess and was too proud to seek. And now, Mrs. Morrison asked gently, Now I stand here publicly acknowledging what I should have acknowledged months ago. Rebecca Harper is my partner in making this farm work. Equal partner. Her mind complements my muscle. Together we're building something neither could build alone. The room divided visibly, some faces softening with understanding, others hardening with judgment. But George wasn't finished. Anyone who thinks accepting her help makes me weak doesn't understand strength. His gaze swept the gathering. Strength isn't stubborn pride that destroys what it claims to protect. Strength is humility to learn, wisdom to recognize expertise wherever it appears, courage to acknowledge truth regardless of social comfort. He sat down, heart pounding. Rebecca's hand found his under the table, squeezed once with warmth that steadied everything inside him. The silence stretched. Then Henderson started clapping, slow, deliberate. Morrison joined. The sound spread unevenly through the hall, some enthusiastic, some reluctant, some refusing entirely. Judge Cooper smiled slightly. Well said, Brennan. Takes more courage to speak that truth than to hide it. The social resumed, but changed now. Some folks approached Rebecca directly, asking questions about market trends and crop selection. Others maintained cold distance. The town had divided over progress versus propriety, and George had chosen his side publicly. Walking home later under winter stars, Rebecca spoke quietly. That cost you. Cost me people who valued tradition over truth. George looked at her. Gained me something more valuable. What's that? Integrity. He smiled. And proof that partnership matters more than pride. She leaned slightly against his shoulder, comfortable and right. Tomorrow the division would remain, some neighbors welcoming, others judging. But tonight, George Brennan slept with conscience clear and future hopeful, having finally defended what mattered most: truth, partnership, and the woman who'd saved what he'd nearly destroyed. Winter settled deep and cold over the prairie, January transforming the world into crystalline silence. George's farm operated with new efficiency now, Rebecca's systems humming like well-maintained machinery. They worked together through the frozen months, planning spring rotations, analyzing market projections, finalizing supplier contracts. The town remained divided, but George no longer measured his worth by their approval. On a night when cold pressed so hard that breath froze instantly, they sat in George's kitchen reviewing year-end accounts. The ledger before them told a story 5 years in the making, red ink slowly replaced by black. Debt reduced. Sustainability established. Profit margin of 8%, Rebecca announced, pencil-tapping calculations. Modest, but solid foundation for expansion. Without you, this would show 20% loss. George studied her across the lamplight. Maybe foreclosure. Without you, I'd have no one to teach these things to. She smiled. Partnership works both directions. They'd fallen into comfortable rhythm over the months, her systematic mind organizing what his practical knowledge produced, decisions made together, risks evaluated jointly, success and struggle shared equally. George had learned markets. Rebecca had learned soil. They'd built something between city expertise and frontier wisdom, something new and stronger than either alone. Should probably head home, Rebecca said, though neither moved. Roads will freeze hard by midnight. Rebecca, George set down his pencil. Been meaning to ask you something. She looked up, reading his tone. This partnership we've built, it saved my farm. Made me better rancher, better businessman, better man. Probably. He met her eyes directly. But lately I've been thinking it could be more different kind of partnership. His hands felt clumsy suddenly. More permanent kind. Rebecca's breath caught. George, let me finish before courage fails. He stood, moving around the table. You came west looking for space to be something besides what grief made you. I was dying under weight of legacy I couldn't maintain alone. Together, we've built something neither could build separately. She stood too, facing him. I'm asking you to make this partnership permanent. Rebecca, not just business, but life. His voice steadied. Not because I need someone to manage my accounts, though I surely do, but because somewhere between market reports and crop rotations, I fell in love with your mind, your patience, your strength. George, I know I'm no city gentleman. Know this life is hard and lonely and sometimes cruel. But with you, it feels possible. Feel like we could build something remarkable together, business and family and future all woven tight. He took her hands. Will you marry me, Rebecca Harper? Will you be my partner in everything? Tears shone in her eyes, lamplight catching them like stars. You're certain? Only thing I've been certain about since day you told me I was planting wrong. She laughed, the sound mixing with tears. Yes, George Brennan, I'll marry you. I'll be your partner in business and life and everything between. He kissed her then, gentle and grateful and full of promise for futures they'd build together. Later, wrapped in coats against brutal cold, they stepped outside. The night sky had transformed, northern lights dancing overhead in ribbons of green and blue and violet. Rare phenomenon painting winter darkness with colors that seemed impossible. It's beautiful, Rebecca whispered. Sign of approval. My mother used to say. George pulled her close. Heaven blessing what it favors. They stood together under Aurora's glow. Two people from different worlds who'd found common ground in partnership and love. City wisdom and frontier strength. Systematic mind and practical muscle. Market knowledge and soil expertise all woven together into something stronger than either possessed alone. Inside, the ledger sat balanced on the kitchen table. 5 years of red ink finally conquered by black numbers that represented more than profit. They represented humility, growth, partnership, truth. They represented two people brave enough to acknowledge what they didn't know, wise enough to learn from each other, strong enough to defend their partnership against judgment. George looked at Rebecca, her face upturned to Aurora's dance, and felt something settle deep in his chest. Peace he hadn't known was possible. Belonging that came from being fully known and fully accepted. What are you thinking? She asked. That my father built this land honest. George said, and we're going to keep building it honest. Together. She smiled, leaning into him. Together. Above them, northern lights continued their ancient dance. Around them, winter held the prairie in frozen grip. Inside them, warmth grew from partnership acknowledged, love declared, future planned. Her mind, his muscle together, they'd built something neither could build alone. The ledger finally balanced, and beneath the numbers, something more valuable balanced too. Two hearts. Two minds. Two lives becoming one partnership stronger than pride, wiser than tradition, built on truth that would outlast any judgment. Spring would bring new crops, new challenges, new growth. But tonight, winter's crystalline beauty blessed their union. And that was enough. That was everything.